And a warm welcome to all the participants in today's webinar. 2024 has been a year unlike any in the recent past. While the cost of delivering global services continued to increase, pricing came to a virtual standstill for many services and even declined for others. This was accompanied by the rising adoption of the GCC model, and that led to significant changes in the economics of outsourcing. In today's webinar, we will discuss both of these points. We'll also share forward-looking perspectives on the services market in 2025. And toward the end, we will talk about the levers that enterprises and providers can pull to realize a win-win relationship. With this context, as we move to the next page, let's have a look at how the global services market has fared in 2024. As is widely perceived, the pandemic years saw very fast-paced growth in the global services market, with market revenue growing at approximately 13% per year between 2020 and 2022, and headcount growing at about 10 to 11% per year. However, there was a distinct slowdown in the growth rates since 2022. The overall market revenue grew at about 3% per year, and headcount was growing at about 2%. Important to call out over here that the numbers that you see, they are not just the revenue or the headcount of service providers in cases of third-party outsourcing, but they also include the numbers coming from in-house or shared services centers. Between these, the in-house or the shared services centers have actually performed better, and service providers have faced a very difficult environment for the last 2 years. Abhishek, from your perspective, what are some of the key attributes of the market for third-party outsourcing?
Yeah, thanks, Rahul, for the context. If you move to the next page. Yeah, so, 2024, as you mentioned, has been a year with a lot of interesting themes that have come through. Broadly, if you look at these themes, they can be grouped into three types. One, of course, being a lot of competition, right? There's intense competition due to new market entrants, right? And then there's also growing competition for talent in tier one hubs. In fact, there are cities in India where very quickly the conversation veers into not about suitability and the underlying metrics, but hey, can we really find talent, right? The second theme is around bottom line and top line pressure, right? So rising inflation, labor costs, FX risk management, really these have influenced a lot of things when it comes to pricing. And then also, there's subdued top line industry growth. There's a lot of vendor consolidation exercises, again, driven by competition. GCC setups, right, are also impacting. So a lot of these themes also creating some kind of a near-term to medium-term top-line pressure. I think to sum it all up, where it really starts is from the client, and it's clear that there are much higher expectations from buyers, and not just in terms of keeping the pricing in check, keeping delivering more transformation, but also some of the themes that you see on the bottom half of this page around sweeteners of all shapes and sizes, right? Amortization, discounts, contingencies, joint innovation, a lot of stuff, right? So, having set that context, Akshay, Kunal, now these are pretty macro themes, but do you want to talk through some of the details on how price and cost parameters have actually moved through 2024?
Sure, Abhishek. And thanks. As we move to the next page, right? This has been a year where we have seen sharp divergence between cost and price across all geographies. If you talk about offshore in particular, an offshore here means your low-cost locations, right? So India, Philippines, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, right? So again, cost continues to rise. You have inflation, you have wage inflation. That being said, for some of these geographies, currency also depreciated considerably. What that meant was that there were some cost pressures which were created, counterbalanced by currency in general, right? Kunal, what are you seeing from a pricing perspective?
Thanks, Akshay. So the pricing has been interesting. Like you mentioned, the cost has gone up. The pricing, at least for the offshore hubs for now, across the IT and the business process services, as you can see, the price movement in the last 9 months or so has stayed flat. And like Rahul mentioned earlier, we are seeing decline in the rate cards for some selective services. For example, if you look at voice BPS, it saw a decline of 1 to 2%, and the impact on the margins were felt by the service providers. Even in the IT application development and the maintenance space, IT infra services included, pricing did see a decline to the extent of about 1.3% on average. And even there, the service providers are feeling a bit of pressure. While the usage of tier two cost effective location has certainly helped maintain the margin, or in some cases, some of the service providers have even enhanced margins through the deployment of cost effective locations. We are seeing the pricing pressure to surmount even in those cities as different suppliers start to explore those locations. Actually, moving on to the near-shore locations, do you see the
Yeah.
cost trends to be materially or significantly different from offshore locations?
So there is a lot of difference, and you made a very interesting point around margins. That is the big question right now. When you talk about nearshore in general, again, they were more hit, they were worse hit when you start comparing them to offshore, right? Just for context, nearshore here means, mid-cost geographies. So think Poland, think Mexico, think Costa Rica, right? So locations in either nearshore Europe, so Central and Eastern Europe, or locations in Latin America. Again, unlike offshore, these countries or these regions don't see currency depreciation. In some cases, rather the currency has appreciated against dollar, right? And that has caused the cost to rise up even further. So the delta which we see across whether it is ADM, infra, voice, is much higher than what we're seeing in offshore. And Kunal, that has an impact on the margins, right, from a price perspective as well.
Absolutely. So, Akshay, if we look at 2022 and 2023, we did see material price increases for some of these locations, be it Poland, be it Romania. The inflation was sky high. And also, due to the geopolitical crisis, the supply was a bit of a constraint. However, in this year, this has been a double whammy for the service provider as a whole. The cost continued to increase up, although at a lower pace. Whereas the pricing change hasn't been much. And again, as you see here, it is definitely much lighter in terms of the reduction compared to the offshore locations, but it's still flat or a muted increase at best, 0.5%, 1.5%, at the most. One interesting observation is that for specialized application development skill sets, the service provider were able to increase their rates. As you can see, that the spread in IT application development and maintenance skills is a bit higher compared to the non-voice BPS or even IT infra services. This could be attributed to the demand for those skill set that continues to be steady, whereas the supply might not be up to the demand increase. So net same situation for the nearshore locations. Let's move on to the onshore locations and cover US because that has been one of the prime geographies in IT and BPO deals. Akshay?
Yep. Yep. So, contrary to the popular belief, most organizations still continue to maintain a pretty decent headcount in onshore locations, which includes United States, which is, of course, the biggest market from a services standpoint, right? Now, within US, what we are seeing is, yes, costs have increased. Of course, because the GDP growth is different, the inflation is different, the numbers are lower, right? And just again, for context, onshore here represents US or even, UK, Germany, France in general, right? Uh, so again, we continue to see cost margin pressures in US as well. Kunal, what are you seeing from a pricing perspective, and what does that mean from a margin standpoint for both GCCs as well as providers in general?
Yeah, so if we look at the outsourcing industry in 2023 latter half and in 2024, the enterprise is pushed back on the service provider pricing. The demand for offshore increased on account of that. However, there are some selective contracts and engagements wherein the shoring model is predominantly onshore centric. For example, I would like to take the example of sales support or even within healthcare. There are certain regulations, for example, within the Medicaid segment, which doesn't allow the service providers to offshore. Now, as the cost increase and the pockets of the enterprises didn't allow that spend to be there, the pressure on the service provider became much more aggressive. They have explored tier two, tier three, and even distressed locations within the US to ensure that they are able to make up the margin, maintain the SLAs and the KPIs that they are committing to somehow. So in those engagements, the pressure was very aggressive on the service provider side. That said, with the inflation cooling off significantly this year, we are talking about 3% inflation in the US. We do anticipate that the margin pressure of the service provider could ease off even at onshore locations. And again, there are real uncertainties about how the macroeconomics would play, how the geopolitical situations would play. But for now, we still feel that the pricing pressure is there to stay for another 6 to 9 months. Akshay, shall we pivot to the next discussion point on our agenda, which focuses on the rise of global capability centers?
Sure. GCCs or global capability centers, right? No meeting in 2024 is complete without discussing this apart from Gen AI. So as we move to the next page, this is a market which has been practically on steroids, right? I mean, the kind of growth we have seen, whether it is in terms of new center setup, whether it is in terms of growth in existing centers, has been fantastic. What this has also meant is that we saw over 300 center setups in the H1 itself, right? And we expect the number to be much higher in H2, right? This is the only segment which continued to grow last year when most outsourced providers were struggling to either maintain their headcount or even some of them saw decline in headcount. The segment still continued to grow at low to mid single digits this year. The number expected to be, mid to high double digits, right? And this market is pretty substantial now. It is almost 80 billion dollars worth of delivery, or more 2.5 million people employed. So in general, has grown a lot. We don't think this is the peak yet. We think this is a rising wave, which will continue to rise at least for the next few years. And we expect this market to remain pretty stable in the next few years. Abhishek, as we think about this, right? I mean, what do we see in the market, right, from an enterprise perspective?
Sure, Akshay, if we move to the next page, let's start off by kind of, getting a view on first-time adopters, right? So expansion of existing centers, I think, has been common, but there's sustained contribution of new adopters in the past 2 years, right? And as we often discuss, these are companies of all shapes and sizes. Maybe they've never really also been exposed to India as a market, or have had no kinds of even market presence here, and that seems to be quite sustained. Now, what really are the factors supporting the first time GCC adopters? As compared to 10, 15 years ago, there's much lower barrier to entry, due to infrastructure growth, due to presence of, third parties, enabling organizations who can set it up. Many of these things, many of the concerns which used to exist back in the day are no longer there. There's established talent pool, which was always there, but over time, what's also happened is that people who started their careers in the entry level runs of the game back in the early 2000s are now in leadership positions. So there's a lot more leadership, talent pool. The cost arbitrage is sustained, right? So much, is the opposite to doomsday naysayers. The cost arbitrage still exists, and then there's quite a robust ecosystem of processes. So I think there's a lot of first time adopter excitement, and for the right reasons, right? Now, this is the situation as of now. What does the future look like? So if we move to the next page, um, you know, the there's no surprises that we expect the market to accelerate. Like Akshay, I'll take your words, like it's on steroids, right? The recent levels of interest we've seen across the Fortune 2000 has practically been unprecedented, right? Now, when we look at the future growth, because part of for argument's sake, one might say, well, because of COVID, there wasn't a lot of setup, so it's just backlog which is coming through, but it doesn't seem to be abating. What do you think is driving, the sustained growth we see into the future as well?
Multiple reasons. First of all, of course, there are immense cost margin pressures, not only on providers, but enterprise as well, right? So they are looking to set up entities in locations where they can find decent cost arbitrage. That's one. The second thing, a lot of these enterprises have realized that you can run global delivery post COVID. You can have a follow the sun model, right? So what that means is they want to go to locations where they can scale, right? So that of course becomes one big challenge. One other challenge which a lot of enterprises face, and this was during the last couple of years, right? During the years of great resignation, they realized that people were leaving jobs. Service providers also saw a lot of attrition, and enterprises had to bear the brunt of it, right? Because of the arm's length distance relationship they had. They don't want to be in that situation anymore. So again, what they are now thinking about is, why don't I open my own setup? I run it. I have better control. Maybe I'll pay my employees better. I'll have better perks, and that will help me control attrition in general, right? And then at the end, it is about having more control, because the prevalent notion is that if you have your own GCC, they are much more motivated to drive value for the enterprise. Again, that is what a lot of enterprises believe. And that kind of helps, or that kind of drives the need to set up something their own, right? As we move to the next page, right, and as I said, this is a very secular market. So it is not as if that we are seeing growth in certain pockets. So if you talk about verticals, industry verticals, we are seeing growth in healthcare life sciences, or we expect to see growth in healthcare life sciences. We expect to see growth in retail, CPG, manufacturing as well, right? Some of the other verticals, even BFSI, which is perhaps amongst the most mature GCC vertical, we expect to see growth there as well, right? Across across the universe, across Fortune 2000, Fortune 5000, where we are seeing a lot of this activity, enterprises also are at different maturity levels. They are at a different maturity level from a service delivery aspect as well. So what that means is, not only there are enterprises which are setting up GCCs and cutting edge tech, right? So for example, 5G labs, Gen AI, analytics, digital. But at the same time, you have a lot of enterprises who are setting up GCCs just to deliver, let's say, the application development, testing, or quality assurance, or infrastructure. So again, we continue to see growth across all functions, purely dependent on where the enterprise is from a maturity standpoint, from an experience standpoint, from a confidence standpoint, right? And we expect that going forward, this will continue to stay so. Now, we have spoken about overall market, we've spoken about the impact of GCCs in general. Rahul, as you think about the crystal ball, right? What do we see in the future from a services market perspective?
Yes, that's something which we will definitely move. We'll cover next in the following section. If you kind of move on to the next slide, we actually want to ask our audience a question first, before we provide the crystal ball from our perspective. So the question is, what is your projection on FT rates in 2025? I request you to choose the option which you believe is most likely. The options are, relatively flat pricing next year, or increase up to 3%, increase beyond 3%, decrease up to 3%, decrease beyond 3%. Abhishek, while we wait for the poll to get completed, question to you, have you seen the prevalence of clients asking exactly this question to us increase in recent times, or has it kind of remained steady throughout?
Yeah, Rahul, actually, this has increased a lot over the past, I'd say 3 to 6 months. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that if you look at the growth cycle, year on year, continuous currency growth of providers, that is now on a hockey stick. So people are then smart in correlating, hey, this is what something, it happened also around the 2021, 22. So if IT rises again, the demand rises, and there is a bit of a supply crunch, it's quite natural for the prices to go up. So they want to then factor it into their planning for next year, which actually seems to be also the case being represented here. It's mostly, as you see, it's either flat and or an increase, right, of 3% or more.
Absolutely, yes. I was definitely expecting to see the relatively flat, answer being the most prominent over here. A tad bit surprised to see the increase up to 3%. Actually, with that, if we move on to the next slide. So, uh, you know, uh, actually, Kunal, let me kind of ask you, your perspective on this particular thing. How would you generally see the pricing, play out for BPO to begin with, and then I will talk about the other functions later.
Yeah, so on the BPO side, and it goes for the IT as well. If you look at the number of deals, primarily there would be a large number focusing on US centered organizations as well as UK centered organizations. Now, the denomination of the currency plays a big role because in most of these contracts, USD or Euro or GBP would be the billing currency. Whereas for some of these offshore locations, the cost would be incurred in their respective geographies, be it India, be it Philippines, be it some of the other offshore geographies. So it would be interesting to see how the FX plays out, and we anticipate further depreciation of offshore local currencies against the USD. If we look at some of the trends emanating from the news floating around post US elections, we do believe that the US greenback can appreciate against some of these local currencies, which in a way could rationalize the pricing a bit more in outsourcing contracts. Broadly, our outlook for 2025 is that the pricing for the offshore locations may reduce further, whereas the pricing for nearshore and the onshore locations would likely remain at similar levels. This is for the new deals that I'm specifically talking about. Of course, there would be engagements wherein there would be a natural increase of pricing because of the inherent COLA clauses or other ECA adjustments. One of the interesting things is that we are seeing some green shoots emerging when it comes to the overall demand from the onshore locations. However, the anticipation is that the pricing pressure would still linger for a good part of the next year until the supply overhang withers off. There's a lot of competition between the supply group themselves. So cost is likely to go up, and price, at least for the new deals, we do anticipate that the pricing would be more or less the same as 2024, or a slight increase or a slight decrease. So that's the story on the BPO side, Rahul.
Yep. And if you look at IT, let's take IT applications for example. We definitely expect inflation to persist. But barring certain premium scales, we expect pricing to actually remain flat at offshore and nearshore. Um, In onshore, actually, there could be, even from a cost perspective, not too much of a movement. We expect costs to remain flat at onshore. And, price is also expected to be, not changing too much. I'll say even in infrastructure, barring some of the specialized skills in cybersecurity and cloud migration, we expect cost and pricing to actually be flat across regions. So the summary of this is essentially that when it comes to costs and prices, we expect that 2025 will be a year of lot of dissimilarities, across regions and across functions, and this is quite different from what we have generally seen as the trend in the prior years. With that, if we move on to the next slide, we also there's some interesting forecasts that we have with regard to the pricing models. Kunal, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so we received a lot of requests on transitioning to alternate and impact commercial model this year from every industry out there. So as the outsourcing entities grapple with cost and margin pressures, parties are exploring and adopting alternate commercial models such as the output-based or the transaction-based model, and even the outcome-based model. And I will just talk about the outcome-based model in a bit. But if we look at the slide in finance and accounting, the adoption of output or the transaction-based pricing model in particular has increased up to 6.5% in last 3 years. And this is on account of enterprises mulling if a change in the pricing model itself can lend to more cost savings as a service provider get more operational flexibility to manage their resources, bring about digital solution that can help in reducing cost. Those are the drivers for a higher adoption of transaction-based pricing model. Interestingly, if you look at the last column, we also observe a higher adoption of outcome-based model in conjunction with the input-based model or even the transaction-based model. We do not see outcome-based model to be a standalone pricing model in BPO services or even in IT services. However, in conjunction with these prominent models, it is being used widely. One of the triggers for a higher adoption of output-based or outcome-based model next year would be the higher adoption of generative AI and even other solutions in engagements. The enterprises are focusing on efficiency, productivity, rather than the effort or the Q side of the equation. So it's important to be aligned with the latest news on how the pricing model is changing in deals. So we strongly anticipate a rise in adoption of the alternate commercial model in 2025. Moving on to the next slide. Yeah, so one of the interesting things to note is the sheer variance in the number of proposals that we observe that mentions the outcome-based construct versus the actual translation of those proposals into signed contracts. As you see in the graphic towards the left, about 95% of the proposal has some form or the other that shows an outcome-based construct. However, only 5 to 15% of those bids actually translate into signed contracts. Now, there are several roadblocks that prevent the higher adoption of outcome-based model. Some of the prominent ones that are at the top of my mind is lack of a baseline, lack of an outcomes attribution framework between the enterprise and the service provider, and even cultural things. For example, some of the buyers that we came across, they had some hesitance to let service providers take control of their business KPIs. However, we do see a rise in the adoption of outcome-based model for certain selective functions. So if you look at consulting services, about 30% of the contracts had a prevalence of outcome-based model. And even on the BPO side, the adoption has increased quite a lot in the last 3 years. Rahul, besides the higher adoption of alternate commercial models, what are some of the other trends that relate to committed cost savings in outsource contracts?
Yes. As we'll see on the next slide, Kunal, buyers are extremely focused on deriving savings in the contemporary deals that they are getting into. These savings essentially, you could kind of classify them, as coming from either, pure play financial levers, or they could be coming from operational levers or operational benefits. Across, or let's say combined across the two, we generally see reductions in, the spend or in TCV, from the existing deal to the new deals that are getting signed, anywhere to the tune of about 30 to 35%. Interestingly, clients have become, much more focused in understanding how much of that is coming from the operational benefits or operational efficiencies. That would include things such as continuous improvements, digital-led benefits, right sizing, right shoring, all of these things. The pure financial benefit levers would essentially be discounting themes or waivers of different kinds like COLA waivers or transition cost waivers, etc. We have seen that, clients are not too happy seeing pure play financial benefits taking the bulk of, the overall savings. Essentially, first of all, that raises a question that, hey, perhaps the price was anyways too high to begin with. So even after a high percentage of discounting, are we actually getting the right price or are we still overpaying? That's point number one. Point number two is, if let's say the intent is to keep on getting more efficiencies, going forward, then will this provider who is essentially relying purely on on the financial benefit side will be able to support us, or should we actually choose one who has a stronger solution, a stronger confidence in terms of realizing efficiencies going ahead? So that's an important takeaway that we see when it comes to some of the managed services scenarios. Uh, with that, let's move on to the next section of the webinar. Uh, Based on all that we have discussed, now let's talk about some of the levers that enterprises and providers can pull in this tough environment to find a win-win solution. Abhishek, you want to kick this off?
Sure. Thanks, Rahul. So the first lever is, especially for providers to navigate through this environment, is the realization that providers can support enterprises very actively in targeted initiatives to drive growth for their GCCs. So GCCs being one of the strategic priorities, and the ability for providers to be a strategic enabler in that makes for a good continuum. So I have for one always believed this to be, as I said, more of a continuum. It's not GCCs and providers. It's not exactly a one-to-one competition. Work shifts one way or the other depending on the strategic priorities at that point in time. It's actually that simple, right? And there's so much of value which providers can create for buyers across their GCC journey. So it's not just about setup; it's about setup, staffing, transformation. There's just tons of stuff which can be do, and such value always has a monetary element which can be derived, right? As we see by the accelerating activity and interest in this space, right? So Akshay, let's speak through some details on the brass tacks of what providers need to put in place to succeed in this space, because it's not, yes, it's something to be taken. It's something which can increase their revenues and repertoire, but it's not really, one size fits all, right? Well, what do you think needs to really be done by providers?
It is not. It is not. And this is a very interesting continuum, as you mentioned, right? So again, what this means is, so yes, enterprises are setting up GCCs. Yes, they are moving work in-house, but we have started to see that some providers have awakened to this, and they've started to see how they can support enterprises. And clearly, there's a need, right? We spoke about this. There's a need for enterprises to take support from providers. Now, what this means for providers is you need to have a dedicated focus on this segment. A lot of models in this space are very different than traditional outsourcing. A BOT construct is very different than any other outsourcing deal, or is it a JV, right? Or for example, if a provider is taking over a distressed captive or a GCC, right? So again, you need to have a dedicated focus, which also means that you need to have a very well-defined go-to-market strategy, right? You need to have a dedicated sales team. You need to forge the right contracts within the broader ecosystem as well. You need to ensure that you have the right set of partnerships or you acquire someone, right? There's a need for having a programmatic focus here, and there are multiple ways in which providers need to approach that, right? As we move to the next page, you've started to see that there are some providers who start already done that, right? What this means is they have actually created those organizational structures, they have created those enablers, they have hired the right talent from GCC space who know the space, who know the people, who know how to run GCCs, right? They have set up dedicated groups who know how to solution deals in the GCC space, and in a way that is how they are differentiating themselves when you start comparing them to some of the other providers. On the next page, you'll see we recently did a peak which was released this year. This peak was all about evaluating leading 24 leading providers which are active in the GCC setup space in India, right? All the good things which I spoke about, right? Having a programmatic structure, programmatic approach, dedicated structure, enablers, partnerships. The leaders in the peak exhibit some or most of these, right? And that is how, and by the way, we are not saying that this is a very mature market. This is a nascent market. It has only been few years since providers have started to focus on this, right? And this is something which will continue to grow. As we speak, we know that multiple providers are actively evaluating how should they be approaching this particular segment. Now, with that, Kunal, we spoke about cost margin pressure, right? We spoke about locations as well. What are we seeing from a location strategy standpoint for both enterprises and providers?
Yeah, so Akshay, that's the another value creating lever that involves utilizing emerging and relatively underutilized locations for services delivery. We have had both sides of the transaction, enterprises, asking us where should we invest when it comes to BPO services or even IT services. And on the service provider side, it's much more important as they go in RFP with their responses, trying to outwit other suppliers on value creation. And of course, the cost is one of the most important value creation lever overall. So if we move to the next slide. Yeah, so what we have here is a list of tier one cities for Europe and APAC and LATAM as well. The key point, if you look at this infographic, is that the tier one locations are really becoming unsustainable for services delivery as the cost continue to surge, be it the salaries of the resources or the cost of the facilities and the utilities and the rentals, etc. Prime locations in India, be it NCR, be it Mumbai, Bangalore, and even within Philippines, Manila, Cebu, they have neared saturation. There are concerns on high inflation and attrition because there are several job opportunities existing in those cities, people hopping different jobs. That can also lead to XLA erosion. The CSAT score and the NPS could reduce real time. The same situation exists for Mexico City. We are witnessing the same trend. Saturation levels in European locations such as Lisbon, Wroclaw, Warsaw, Bucharest, it's increasing at a rapid pace. Now, if we look at outsourcing contracts, there has to be a differentiated value. And that differentiated value can be realized by tapping into certain cities, locations where the competition is relatively low. And at the same time, there is enough or sufficient talent that exists for services delivery. With that, Rahul, would you like to cover which are those locations which can bring about differentiated value in outsourcing contracts?
Yep, sure. Um, so if we move on to the next slide, the good news is that locations beyond the traditional tier one cities, they have been there on providers' radar for quite some time. There has been reasonably strong action on the ground as well in terms of setting up delivery centers in many tier two, tier three locations at onshore, nearshore, as well as offshore locations. Typical reasons to kind of do this are essentially capitalizing on the untapped talent pools, seeing lower competitive pressures in these kind of cities, as well as marginal cost advantages. Now, within the list of locations that are shown on this slide, the ones that witnessed maximum traction, with five or more center setups are essentially Atlanta in Georgia, USA, um, IRC in Romania, Katowice in Poland, Leeds in the UK, and in India, we are seeing a lot of traction happen in Ahmedabad, Coimbatore, and Jaipur. Um, Moving on, Abhishek, what do you think are the levers that you're observing as being prominent in some of the recent deals that you have been part of?
Sure, Rahul. As they say, as you mentioned, um, even on the location side, right? Everything seems to be on the table, right? There's the options to choose from have grown so much as compared to a few years ago, where you could count them on your fingertips, and a number of these cities where you mentioned more than five. It means that it's becoming to be quite a tenable location. It's not just one company who's gone there as a fluke, right? If you move to the next page, right? Just like locations, even the levers, everything's on the table, right? From a buyer perspective, let me just quickly cover a few of these. So, clearly, locations portfolios, we've already spoken about it. I won't repeat it. Significant focus on vendor consolidation, scope consolidation, and what I'd say is rebalancing between one versus the other. So we've heard a lot about champion challenger and using the service quality, service effectiveness as a lever to pass on more work to one vendor versus the other. It becomes a normal, a very effective incentivization mechanism, right? Then there are things like rebalancing solution elements like delivery pyramids for non-complex functions. I mean, do you really need those many kind of senior people? Tier two locations that offer untapped talent and cost savings perspective. And then finally, where would we be without benchmarking clauses in contracts? And while they've been around for years, incorporating them in the right way with the right level of detail makes the entire difference, right? And final thing which we'll say, gone are the days when a benchmarking exercise used to be months and months of deliberations and a very costly exercise. I think over time things have been whittled into quite a quick art form. So buyers are considering a lot of these things depending on which part of the sourcing cycle they're in. So Akshay, while I've covered these elements from a buyer perspective, I can definitely vouch for the fact that from an analytical numbers perspective, just the levers available to optimize costs for providers and increase their margins is way more interesting, as I've seen the chart on the next page. So why don't we go there and take our participants through that?
No, absolutely, Abhishek. And while yes, this is an important point for buyers, I think maybe safe to say that it is even more important for providers, right? Everyone has been grappling by under severe cost margin pressure. Now, the chart you see here is a real life example which we have seen. This is a provider operating at a certain margin level. What they have done is they have extensively benchmarked most of their solution levels, right? So Abhishek spoke about some of those on the previous page. So it includes, tweaking your shoring ratios, how much offshore, onshore, nearshore you should have for various functions, various deals, right? It is about tweaking your locations mix. So should you have people in tier one? Should you have people in tier two, which potentially can give you 8 to 15% cost arbitrage? It is about tweaking components around payroll and non-payroll costs, seeing if you're paying lower than the market, higher than the market, right? We have realized that a lot of providers also tend to have, while yes, from a delivery pyramid perspective, you'll have an L1, you'll have an L2. We have seen that the definition of L1 and L2 varies, let's say in the terms of number of years of experience, right? And then Gen AI, again, the other buzzword of the year, apart from GCC, and how can you leverage Gen AI to, increase productivity, increase automation, and essentially drive down costs, right? So again, all of these levers combined, we have seen has helped, and this is for a particular provider, drive down cost lower. We also have to realize that it is not only about cost, right? If you're able to reduce your cost, if you're able to squeeze that extra, margin, it becomes a competitive play. Instead of keeping all these 300 basis point and above for yourself, you can potentially choose to pass it on to some of your clients, which means you become much more competitive on your rate, right? So again, as as some of you on the provider community side, right, as you struggle with cost pressures, there are some of these levels which are available to you, which can help reduce that pressure, which can help drive margin, and which can help boost your competitiveness in the market. Right? So that's largely what we wanted to cover from a webinar perspective today. Rahul, do you want to talk about what our recipients can get from a
Absolutely. Thanks, Akshay. So yes, we want to share a message with our enterprise audience. You can sign up for our complimentary price check, which would essentially allow you to gauge your current status. How competitive are your currently contracted rates against the market benchmarks, and figure out if there is value waiting to be unlocked in your contracted rates. So you to sign up, you can just click on the link, which you will see in the chat window. You can choose one of the functions between IT applications or finance and accounting or contact center. And within the selected function, you can select up to 2 roles for which you would need the price benchmarks. You can also choose, 2 locations out of the 6 that we are showing on this particular slide. Once we receive the details from you, we would share the relevant price benchmarks with you. Moving on. So yeah, that brings us basically to the Q&A section. We have received quite a few questions, as the audience was signing up for the webinar. We've also received quite a few during the Q&A, during the webinar session itself. So let's take up some of the questions. I think the first one is, what are the greatest cost-saving efficiencies being commonly found by all providers of BPO? Akshay, you want to take this one up?
Sure. So again, very similar to what you're discussing just now, right? For most providers, whether it is on the BPS side, the operations side, or the technology side, right? Multiple levels are available, and there are differences in the market. So, for example, we know that for some providers, let's say the share of their workforce in tier two is 15%, 17%, 18% in India. But then on the other hand, there are providers which are below 5% right now. So there are a lot of opportunities for those to, kind of increase their level. Similarly, some providers like to solution their deals with more onshore, nearshore leverage. While at the same time, there are providers who are, let's say, able to solution deals even within Europe, right? Even within, let's say, Germany or France, purely from an offshore perspective, or a good mix of offshore along with nearshore. So again, some of these levers include shoring ratios, leverage of tier one, tier two, payroll versus non-payroll costs versus your competition or versus your GCC peers. How much staff from a corporate or enablement function perspective do you have based out of, let's say, onshore, how senior they are. So again, all of these levers kind of add up, and they kind of tack on and increase your cost base, right? So again, providers can elaborate, can actually assess these levers to see if they can save some cost.
Yep, very insightful. Thank you, Akshay. The next one is, Clients are hyper focused on cost savings through operational efficiency. However, when it comes to providers connecting to the client systems, then this frequently slows down technology adoption for greater gains. Does the team see this? Abhishek, what are your thoughts around this?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, Rahul. So this is a common complaint that we see in the middle or early stages of a contract, that there's a lot which is promised, right? And clients also want it, providers want to deliver it, but then there's issues related to IT, technology coverage, alignment, integrations, etc. So yes, it does happen. I think even with the best of intent, it does happen. The I think the important thing which some mature providers have now started doing is that rather than a zero or one and uncertainty around it, they've actually put down certain slabs that, hey, if for example this part of the integration does not happen, or we're not provided access to this kind of the system, right, this is how much the promised efficiency goes down. It goes from, let's say, 40% to 30%. I'm choosing random numbers here, rather than a complete, oh my god, the technology is not integrating and we can't deliver it. So there are ways and means around it to get more clarity on both sides. But to the exact question, yes, this is quite common, especially in complex technology environments.
Yep, absolutely. Uh, the next one is how are the pricing models evolving, between the previous years and how they stand today? So obviously the answer to that would be quite dependent on which function we are talking about. Is it BPO, within BPO, which exact function? Is it FNA? Is it HR? Is it contact center? Or actually, are we talking about IT apps or IT infra? But if I have to kind of generalize and talk about the overall trend that we see, first of all, if you look at it fundamentally, there are three types of models, right? There is the input based, which is the FT based pricing. Then there is output based or transaction based pricing. And then there is the outcome based pricing. So the general trend that we are observing is that across functions, the prevalence of TNM or input based pricing is gradually decreasing. We are seeing increased prevalence of output based and outcome based pricing models. But a slightly even more important trend is that these are not uh, essentially binary kind of statements that, hey, a deal is having only hybrid, only having TNM or only having output based or only having outcome based pricing models. In fact, a lot of the deals that we are seeing today, they are hybrid in a sense. Some elements would be based on a TNM construct. There could be other elements which are, let's say, output based or outcome based. That's what is actually really catching on. We believe that is going to be a very prevalent trend even in the coming 1 or 2 years. Okay. Akshay, the next question again goes back to you. Is India still the preferred offshore destination?
Um, yes and no. I mean, it is the preferred offshore destination. However, we have started to see a crop of enterprise providers who are over-indexed on India already, right? So for some of those, they do continue to explore locations outside of India, right? So they might think about a Philippines. If you are maybe in deep tech, you might think about, let's say, Vietnam, right? If you are okay with slightly higher cost, maybe you think about locations in CEE if you want to stay in Europe, or maybe locations in nearshore Americas if you want to be in the same time zone as US. That being said, India, and by and large, is the largest geography. If you think from a delivery perspective, a good number of providers, large ones, they have almost 60, 70, 75% of their headcount in India, roughly 1,700 GCCs if you were to look at the in-house side, right? Almost 1.5 million people in India out of the 2.5, 2.6 million people working in GCCs in nearshore, offshore, right? So in general, yes, it is the preferred destination. Yes, it is the largest destination. It is easy to scale to, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 uh, strong delivery centers. But yes, if you are over-indexed for BCP, some of the enterprises, some of the providers do explore or do want to have that India plus one strategy as well.
Makes sense. Okay, the next question is somewhat related to the one that we just addressed on pricing models. The question is, where is the focus for pricing for our clients in BPO? Are they still on FT rates, or are they more firmly focused now on the total cost of ownership? Kunal, you want to offer any insights on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some RFPs which are very prescriptive in nature, a lot of roles across locations, and they are looking for a time and material rate card. And in those engagements, talking about TCO wouldn't help. It's all about your rate cards across locations, across roles. However, as we see in BPO services, the transition to managed services has been quite, sharp. And in the managed services deal, the focus is more on TCO optimization. We have seen engagements wherein the service providers are also committing to rationalizing the cost on the retained organization side. And that's where the TCO equation comes in handy. Along with the committed productivity through digital, as well as some of the best in class operational continuous improvement themes. So, depending upon the engagement, depending upon the opportunity, the focus could be on the TCO or the rate card itself in BPO.
Yep.
Thank you, Kunal, for that. I think with that, we move on to the closing slides. One important message for our audience: Everest Group is bringing our Engage conference to London. As some of you would know, we did the first conference in October in Dallas, and we'll be doing a similar conference now in London on 31st and 1st of April. The conference will be focused on GBS, sourcing, and vendor management leaders. So we look forward to seeing some of the audience in today's webinar over there as well. For more details, you can go to our website or just click on the link that you will see in the chat window. With that, we have essentially reached the end of the webinar. Thank you to the audience for joining us today. And thank you to my co-panelists as well for all the valuable insights.